Mr. Commissioner, for the record, it's Chris Harvey for the Area G Trollers and the United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union. Most of my questions, I think, will be directed to you, Mr. Nelitz. I apologize to Dr. Wiskowski. I'm not ignoring you and your contributions, but it's just that the questions I wish to follow up on seem to fall in Mr. Nelitz's area particularly, but you, of course, are free to intervene. Mr. Nelitz, do you agree with me that half of the life cycle of Fraser sockeye occurs in fresh water, and most of the total egg to adult mortality of Fraser sockeye occurs in the egg to smolt freshwater stage?
Yes.
So your area of study is very important for that reason alone. And do you agree also that stressors that occur in freshwater can manifest themselves and cause problem in the later marine stages?
There are some hypotheses, mechanisms of that happening, yes.
Now, under the terms of reference of this commission, the commissioner is directed to consider DFO policies and practices with respect to the Fraser sockeye fishery and develop recommendations relating to the Fraser sockeye fishery. And I think you've acknowledged that the fishery, the Fraser sockeye fishery, is dominated by a few large stocks.
That's my general understanding, but I'm certainly not an expert in the Fraser River fishery.
All right. I mean, I understand that 3 major stocks account for more than half of the Fraser sockeye production. That's the Quesnel, the Chilko, and the late Shuswap.
That's my understanding as well.
Yes. So if you are trying to explain the decline of the fishery in the aggregate, you would want to start by focusing on the major lakes then, would you not?
Decline of the fishery?
Fishery, yes.
Which I would add is different than the terms or the analyses that we were looking at, which is looking at decline in the productivity of the aggregate Fraser.
Yes, and you've itemized a lot of individual CUs because of that, but I'm referring to the terms of, not your terms of reference, but the terms of reference of this commission to look at the sustainability of the Fraser sockeye fishery.
Yes.
And if you're doing that, you'd want to focus on the major stocks, would you not?
Well, I think, I guess it depends on the specific question you're trying to analyze. So some of the discussion came up earlier. I think other CUs may be important as well, though. So just looking at, say, for example, how the cultus, the concerns around cultus have affected the fishery, that there are implications of smaller CUs on the fishery overall. So I guess I'm not sure on what kind of question you're specifically trying to ask and through an analysis, but I would think that yes, those CUs would be important, but I would also think that other CUs would be important in understanding that as well.
Yes, all right. Well, and I think that's apparent from your report, but like Dr. Hyatt in that passage that Mr. Rosenblum read to you, I interpret the decline in the overall fishery as being the reason for this commission, and so I'm going to confine my questions to ecological factors affecting the larger stocks. And in that light, you would agree with me that the ecology as such includes the relationship between juvenile sockeye in this context and their food supply.
Yes.
And you've studied 6 stressors, forestry, mining, urban development, etc. But you'd agree with me that for a juvenile salmon in the freshwater rearing area, an insufficient food supply would be a very significant stressor.
Yes.
As would an increase in predation.
Yes.
There's a passage I'd like to refer you to towards the end of Exhibit 562, the technical report number 3, page 147. And I'm going to read the comment of this reviewer and ask whether you agree with it, starting near the bottom of the page. In summary, it is possible that subtle climate-driven changes in the ecology of the nursery lakes may be producing less food or food of lower quality than historically, which is creating higher mortalities in juvenile sockeye during their migration to the open ocean, as they are nutritionally deficient in energy reserves. This may be the explanation for the statement given at the November 30th, December 1st workshop and various Cohen Commission science reports that, quote, this observation indicates either that the primary mortality agents in the sockeye occurred in the post-juvenile stage, or that certain stressors that were non-lethal in fresh water cause mortality later in the sockeye's life history. Nutritionally deficient juvenile sockeye may be more susceptible to variations in food quantity and quality in the Georges Strait to ward off microbial pathogens and parasitic sea lice from open net pen fish farms and variable ocean productivity in the early ocean migrations in Georges Strait and on the continental shelf. In other words, some juvenile sockeye may have left home on an empty stomach or a diet of junk food and were poorly equipped to deal with the rigors of smoltification, migration, and predator disease avoidance. Would you agree with the general thrust of that comment?
I would agree that Dr. Ken Ashley has put forward a plausible hypothesis of how changes in food supply in the nursery lakes may be affecting sockeye.
And I see from your response at page 148 that you acknowledge the plausibility of that, but you're aware of and then you make reference to the Selby analysis that Mr. Prouse drew to your attention. And you say that analysis found no detectable changes over time. I've looked at that analysis, but it seems to me that the emphasis should be on over time, because the food sources in the freshwater system were found to have recovered before the next dominant cycle, but they were definitely depleted by the dominant cycle in, for example, the Quesnel. I think it's the Quesnel that Selby deals with in particular. Would you like to look at the Selby report? We had it earlier. It's in Exhibit 573, yeah. I think.
Yeah, no, I understand your statement, and yes, I would agree, that's correct.
Yes, all right. All right, well, we needn't look at it then in the interest of time. Because what the evidence shows, I think, the analysis in these larger lakes, is that when there's been an escapement, a spawning escapement that is over the optimum, the food sources are found to be depleted towards the fall of the year, so that when these fry go into their overwintering type of hibernation, that they are often malnourished. Is that a fair way to put it?
Sorry, Mr. Commissioner, Brenda Garrett. I wonder if Mr. Harvey could tell us where that evidence is or where it comes from. That's an interesting summary, and I just, if it's Dr. Selby's evidence or the evidence that's been before this commission.
All right. Well, yes, I can get to it. Perhaps Mr. Nelitz would comment on the general, broad statement that I've made, and if it's too broad, you'll say so.
I'm certainly not I'm not a limnologist, and so I don't feel fully qualified to comment on specific changes in food web dynamics and the timing of that and how that coincides with the health of smolts going into overwintering stages, and the evidence that's available to look at that, to support that.
All right. You can't comment, or can you, as to whether further limnology studies of the nursery lakes with respect to the quantity and quality of planktonic food should be made?
We've made statements in our report that we support limnological programs and studies and some enhancement of that above the existing monitoring that's ongoing, and that's based on based on our review of the data and the expertise of others in the team, which I would say is much stronger in limnology than myself.
All right. I could find only 2 paragraphs in your report as such dealing with this question, and that's, if we could look at it in Exhibit 562 at page 17. I'd like to just refer you to paragraph 2.2.3, indicators of rearing habitat quantity quality. And I'll just read a portion and ask you a question about it. You say, after the heading of nursery lake area and productivity, the Fraser River is the world's largest single producer of sockeye salmon, being surpassed only by combined sockeye salmon production from several river systems flowing into Bristol Bay in Alaska. The Fraser system's exceptionally high productivity is due to the presence of many large lakes, 66% of BC's nursery lake area, that are accessible to anadromous fish. And then you refer to Hume and Shortreed. There are 2 papers, I guess, one by Hume in '96, one by Shortreed 2000. And you say, further, most of these lakes are sufficiently productive to obtain a zooplankton community considered capable of supporting high juvenile sockeye salmon densities. You refer to another paper, and you say it is generally assumed that most Fraser sockeye salmon lakes are recruitment limited. That is, these spawning levels are below optimum. Is that what that means? Recruitment limited?
That's my understanding of that, yes.
Yes. With freshwater rearing habitats often capable of supporting juvenile sockeye salmon densities far higher than presently occur, i.e. a greater number of spawning escapements will produce additional smolts. Then you have a footnote. You say in the footnote, though we also acknowledge an opposing density-dependent hypothesis, which suggests that escapement may already be too high in some rivers. But I want to ask you this. You refer to that as a hypothesis, but surely it's not a hypothesis that the basic concept that there has to be a limit to the density of salmon fry that any lake can sustain.
Yes.
With respect to the evidence, and in response to Ms. Gertner's request, I'd like to refer to the first of the papers that you referred to in the passage I read. That's the Hume et al. 1996. And I've circulated that on Friday and asked Mr. Lund to bring it up, first of all, so that you can identify it. Is this the paper that you refer to in that paragraph that I just read?
Yes, it is.
Okay. I'd like to refer you to the second page of it, page 720, towards the bottom of the left-hand column. Start there with the paragraph beginning, because most Frasers sockeye stocks were recruitment limited, for most of this century. Increasing escapements within the constraints imposed by the commercial fishery have been a primary goal of Fraser River sockeye managers. Owing to uncertainties about the cause of the 4-year cycle of abundance, those rebuilding efforts have been largely restricted to the dominant and to a lesser extent subdominant cycle years. The rebuilding efforts have been successful in some Fraser system lakes, and particularly so in the lakes in this study. The study, I think, covers Chilco, Shuswap, and Quesnel. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
During the rebuilding period, when escapements were relatively low, rearing capacity of the lakes was not a concern. Rather, optimum escapement estimates were based on estimates of spawning ground capacity, Roos 1989, and that's, I believe, the book that's in evidence here at Exhibit 75, the Salmon Commission's book. Since the 1980s, in Shuswap and Quesnel lakes, in 1990 in Chilco, dominant and subdominant brood year returns and escapements have been very high. Figure 1, the 1958 return to Shuswap was also high, but subsequent returns dropped considerably and have been building ever since. A determination of escapement levels that will maximize subsequent adult returns is now crucial to the efficient management of Fraser sockeye stocks. Now, I'd like to ask you first, with respect to the 1958 return to the Shuswap, do you agree with me that that was an early example of what's often been termed over-escapement?
I don't know. I can't comment on that.
You can't, all right. With respect to the statement that determination of escapement levels that will maximize subsequent adult returns is now crucial, do you agree with that statement?
Yes.
Okay. And I'd like to continue reading. Escapements lower than the optimum will result in reduced adult returns. In any brood year, escapements higher than the optimum entail foregoing harvestable sockeye and will produce at best no increase in harvestable sockeye in subsequent brood years. If high escapements result in excessive fry recruitment, and if the high escapements are consecutive, substantial and long-term declines in total stock size may occur, resulting in considerable economic loss. Since the mid-1980s, we have been conducting studies on these 3 lakes. Our studies are the first that have included detailed investigations of every major lake trophic level, from the microbial community to planktivorous fish, as well as measurement of salient physical and chemical variables. This ecosystem approach has enabled us to produce the first estimates of optimum spawning escapements based on a lake's productivity and its ability to rear juvenile sockeye. Now, the reference there to the first estimates of optimum spawning escapements, do you agree with me that the writers must be referring to the first estimates done on a scientific basis? Because we've heard in evidence here that prior to 1985, the Salmon Commission had estimates of optimum spawning escapements based on experiential or empirical knowledge.
I'm not familiar with and can't comment on contrasting forms of evidence by which those optimum spawning escapements were derived. I don't know the quality, or I can't compare them at all in my own mind.
Page 730, the bottom left-hand column. gives the conclusion about halfway through that paragraph. Predicted optimum total adult escapements. This is the result of the paper. Could that be blown up a bit? In the middle of the, yes, that's it. It's about halfway through that paragraph, the sentence beginning, predicted optimum total adult escapements, equivalent to S max for Chilko, Quesnel, and Shuswap lakes were 0.62, 1.06, and 1.85 million, respectively. And then they give it in EFS, that's effective female spawner terms as well. The 1.85 million for the that these analysts found on this basis to be the optimum for the Shuswap, I just note, is very close to what the Salmon Commission described as the optimum escapement in 1954 that led to the 58 record return, and it's very much spot on the 2006 escapement to the Shuswap, which led to the 2010 return. But I take it this is not something that you considered in your review of ecology factors in the freshwater system.
Can you phrase that as a question, please?
Well, the question is, did you focus in your paper at all on the optimum carrying capacity, or optimum in terms of optimum spawning escapement, optimum escapement levels in any of these three major lakes?
No, we did not, in part because Selby et al., through their work for the Pacific Salmon Commission workshop, did look at optimum escapements and recent observations of spawners relative to those optimum escapements.
Well, there's nothing in the Selby paper that contradicts the data in this paper, is there?
I haven't done a comparison of the two to know for certain if that's true or not.
All right. If we go back to page 728, there's a graph that illustrates, I think, what happens. There are two graphs there. We'll take the bottom one, the Chilko Lake. You see the along the bottom is effective female escapement. So as the escapement increases, we move from left to right. And the vertical axis is the macrozooplankton, in other words, the food supply. And the bottom line is Chilko Lake not fertilized, and it shows how the zooplankton levels drop off dramatically as female spawner escapement increases, and they drop off less dramatically when fertilization is applied to the lake. That's and I think you mentioned fertilization in the course of your evidence. That's something you're familiar with.
I'm familiar with fertilization, yes.
And you're familiar that fertilization was applied in the Chilko Lake for a number of years in the 80s and 90s?
I'm familiar that it was applied there. The specific years I'm not familiar with.
Yes. It's covered at page 724 of this paper. There's a short paragraph on lake fertilization. Turn to page 724. It makes reference to the fertilization program. Says it was widely used in successful sockeye enhancement technique in British Columbia. Mid-80s, Chilko Lake was identified as a candidate. Consequently, nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers were applied to the lake for 6-week periods. Now, you mentioned fertilization in answer to a question from Mr. Timberg. You referred to carcasses of salmon effectively adding nutrients. But you were not intending to suggest, were you, that we should use one of the most valuable fish species in the world for fertilizer as opposed to nitrogen and phosphorus?
I'm not suggesting, my intention is not to suggest any management actions, so that could be one management action, and there may be preference for that over artificial means. I'm not suggesting either of those as being preferable or not.
All right. I'd like to go back to your report, Exhibit 562, and turn to page 62 of the report.
Mr. Harvey, did you wish to mark that before you move on?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I do. Could that be marked, please?
That would be Exhibit 575.
Right. Exhibit 562, page 62. The graph at the top of the page is quite a dramatic graph showing the, am I interpreting it right, showing the drop in productivity from 1952 to 2008, or 2009, I suppose.
That's correct.
The first big drop is after the 1958 escapement that I mentioned earlier. And then there's a rebuilding, and then a gradual drop off in the 90s to the present. The phenomenon of over-escapement and depletion of food supply in the rearing lakes after an excessively large escapement is referred to as density-dependent effects, is it not?
That's correct.
Yeah. Do you agree that this commission should consider the possibility of density-dependent effects as being a possible major contributor to the downward trend that we see in this graph in the 1990s?
Again, Mr. Commissioner, this is the same objection I had to Mr. Rosenblum's earlier questions. It's not for this witness to identify what the commission should be looking into or not looking into.
All right.
I would add, I agree with what was just said, but I would add, it was also my understanding, if you look at the preface of our report, and it should be at the front of all reports, the technical reports, that there are 12 projects listed here, and Project 10, Fraser River Sockeye Production Dynamics, is a study which I believe investigates some of the questions and observations you have around changes in production dynamics of the Fraser populations.
All right. Thank you. I believe that's set for sometime in April.
I'm sorry, if I could just interrupt for one moment. If Mr. Harvey, you could give us some indication of how long it'll be, because you're at the end of the estimate you had indicated earlier.
If I could have another about 6 minutes, I think I can do it. 5 minutes.
5.
All right. Just this closing point. If the cause of the 2009 failure does not arise in freshwater, it would, of course, have to be found in the marine phase of the sockeye life cycle. I expect you to agree with that.
Yes.
But
I would add on the smolt out migration.
Oh yes, all right. But I'm going to just ask you, give you some evidence against marine phase causative factors, and ask you to comment on it. First of all, we have the pink and the chum salmon fishery, which has been increasing in abundance, while sockeye has been decreasing. The pink and chum have different freshwater habitats and a different time that they spend, a lesser time that they spend in freshwater. So that would be an indication weighing against a marine cause and pointing more to a freshwater cause, would it not?
I think this question relates to some of the work that I think Project 10 and as well Project 6, the cumulative impact analysis, and looking at changes in dynamics of other species and how that might be informative to providing insights. I feel that it's more appropriate for experts in those who's done the analysis in those projects to comment on that specific point than myself.
All right. I won't ask you any questions about it. There's a further paper, I should have done this earlier. At page 17, you refer also to a paper by Shortreed in 2000. And I'd like Mr. Lund to bring up a paper that I circulated over the weekend. Perhaps you could turn to the second page of that, Mr. Lund. Is that the Shortreed 2000 paper that you refer to on page 17?
1 minute, please. Yes, it is.
And I'm just going to ask you to refer to one passage on page 507, then I'll sit down. The last 4 lines of this first full paragraph on that page, starting with conversely. Conversely, the cost in lost production from not enhancing a stock could be assessed. And he says, furthermore, when escapements exceed that required to maximize smolt production, the economic cost of the foregone catch can also be determined. In short, a reliable rearing capacity model would be a powerful tool for fisheries managers concerned with maximizing and sustaining BC sockeye salmon. Would you agree with that last sentence, that a reliable rearing capacity model would be a powerful tool for fisheries managers? Or is that something?
Yes, I think it's a powerful tool from the point of managing the fishery.
Yes, all right. I have no further questions. Thank you.
Mark that last document, Mr. Harvey.
Oh, yes, please. Yes, could that last document be marked, please?
576.
I just wanted to ask Mr. Nelitz what he understands to be the reference to a reliable rearing capacity model. What is that?
In the context of some of these papers, in this paper specifically, they're talking about this photosynthetic rate model in terms of estimating capacity of lakes to produce smolts and the spawners required to produce those smolts. That's my understanding of. In terms of reliable, I haven't done I think the previous paper does a comparison of alternative models. This paper is talking about the photosynthetic rate. DFO, this is the leading model. My understanding, leading model the DFO is using in terms of their management. So I'm relying on the assessment that they've done in terms of which is the most reliable, most accurate. But certainly the photosynthetic rate model is one that's the leading candidate, my understanding at this stage.
Mr. Commissioner, could I just give a definition to that, see whether this is correct? It's often referred to as PR, isn't it? Photosynthetic rate?
Yes.
And is that the process by which carbohydrates are synthesized from carbon dioxide and water using light as the energy source?
I don't want to be misrepresenting that model. I'm not that familiar with it.
All right.
Mr. Commissioner, before Mr. Harvey sits down, I just want to raise this concern around the timing of documents and disclosure of them. Mr. Harvey let us know he was going to use those articles over the weekend, which does not give us time as participants to look at those documents, imagine what he might use them for, and imagine what else might be useful for the Commissioner to hear that in context. And so I just want to put that on record. I know we're going to talk about this more. I'm hoping we'll talk about it amongst council, but this is increasing as we go along, and I just want to note that we don't get opportunities to put that kind of context to you as a result of that.
Mr. Commissioner, the next council will be Leah Pence for the First Nations Coalition.
Pence, first initial L for the First Nations Coalition, and with me is Ms. Gertner. Just as a context, as Ms. Gertner may have mentioned to you offline, the First Nations Coalition is a group of First Nations who's a participant in this inquiry, including Council of Haida Nation, some of the Douglas Treaty Nations, and then a number of different First Nations organizations all the way to the Upper Fraser, as well as the provincial organization, the First Nations Fisheries Council. And our clients are really most interested in participating in this inquiry for the forward-looking recommendations that'll come out of it on the sustainability of the Fraser River sockeye salmon. I have 5 areas of questioning. I'd like to ask you some questions about the role of values within management objectives and within science. I'd like to ask you questions about methodologies for assessing CUs, and those will be for CU status, and those will be directed to Ms. Wachowski. The distribution metric is one of the assessment tools for CUs. Some questions about the context of this project and the work of Peterman et al., and the context of looking at this within the aggregate. And then I'll close with looking at some of the gaps in the information that you were having to deal with, and some of the dialogue that you had with the peer reviewers and next steps. Ms. Wachowski and Mr. Nellitz, on Thursday in your testimony, you took care when answering questions to separate out what can be called the scientific perspective from management values. And I think it was Ms. Wachowski, you noted in response to a question from Mr. Timberg about the determination of benchmarks, that ultimately where you set a benchmark is a value-based decision based upon your perception and what your risk tolerance is. And I wonder if Mr. Lund could pull up Exhibit 8, which is the wild salmon policy. And to go to page 17, because what I'm struck with is just how similar what you said on Thursday is to what the text of the wild salmon policy says. And it's the second paragraph on page 17. And I'm reading from about halfway through. It says, "There is no single rule to use for the determination of the lower benchmark. Rather, it will be determined on a case-by-case basis and depend on available information and the risk tolerance applied. The determination of the risk tolerance to apply is a value judgment that requires consultation with First Nations and others affected by this choice." And my question is, would you agree that one of the central value judgments that will have to be made in the context of the wild salmon policy is where to put the benchmarks? And so I mean where to put the, where to separate the amber from the red and the amber from the green.
Within the context of Strategy 1, I would say yes.
Okay, thank you. And from both of your perspectives, as persons who are qualified and as experts on policy implementation and management frameworks and strategic and structured decision making, can you note for us some of the other examples of these value-based decisions within the wild salmon policy, so moving beyond just Strategy 1? Where do you see those value judgments that are embedded in the wild salmon policy?
I think more generally speaking, the objectives and goals of the wild salmon policy in and of itself are value judgments in terms of what society values, what DFO as the management or as the managing group for salmon, what they see as the priorities are with regards to salmon management. more specifically within each of the strategies, and that translates down to each of the strategies, those high-level value judgments of the objectives and goals of the policy in terms of what sort of indicators one even puts forward, because those indicators ultimately need to inform whether or not objectives are being met. And translating down from those indicators the metrics and the benchmarks that you're going to be using to evaluate those indicators.
So if I've heard you right, the metrics for monitoring CUs contain value judgments, is that right?
They receive direction from, they're trying to meet, they're not value judgments in and of themselves. The value judgment is put with the objective or the goal of the policy, and there's then the best means to be able to inform that objective or that goal, whether or not one's achieving that goal. And so choosing a specific metric isn't necessarily the value judgment. It's received direction from something that was a value judgment.
Okay, so choosing the metrics, kind of the value judgments that are stated in the objectives of the wild salmon policy will trickle down when you're setting metrics or when you're looking at habitat indicators. Am I understanding you right?
Correct.
Thank you.
If I can add to what Ms. Wojcicki said, so I think there are value judgments related to assessing habitat status under Strategy 2, the ecosystem components that are being considered as part of Strategy 3. It's a value judgment about what ecosystem is valued. Say, for example, bears, riparian vegetation in communities, which also derive benefits from some of the nutrients from salmon. So are those things that are, there's a choice in terms of what components of the ecosystem are you going to value and incorporate in the decision making. As well, I think, is the value judgment in terms of Strategy 4 and integration. So if you're trying to integrate agencies, data collection, decision making, things like that around fisheries harvest, that's a value judgment to do that. But if there's also a choice, value judgment to integrate decisions around land and water use, that's also another value judgment. And which components of land and water use do you want to be integrating decision making around and integrating the science? So I'd say that those are some additional points, I think, within the wild salmon policy where there are value judgments embedded within it.
Thank you. I want to move now to some questions about how values are often directly or indirectly presented in any given scientific work. And I take from your evidence last week that both of you feel strongly about the importance of science as a tool for decision makers, as distinct from science being a decision maker. And is it correct that your views are that science, including the science conducted by DFO, would only get stronger and more objective when its role within structured decision-making processes is both clear and transparent?
Yes, I would agree with that.
And would you also agree that when embarking on a scientific undertaking, be it this report or testing another hypothesis, the answer or conclusion that you reach will be largely dependent on what question is asked and how that question is framed?
Yes, I agree.
Given this, can you speak to the benefit of having all those who are necessarily part of a decision-making process be involved in setting the questions or the terms of reference or the science agenda, and of asking the questions, be involved in asking the questions of scientists? Put it for either of you.
Well, ultimately, the importance of including the different parties is if they're having an influence, direct influence on the resource, whether that be direct or indirect effect. So if there are, say, certain provincial government agencies that make decisions around land use, and those land uses affect sockeye and fish habitats, then and we're trying to protect those fish populations, then it's important to try to include that, because that's one of the mechanisms by which the population is being affected. So you need to include that audience in the framing of the question to ensure that well, I shouldn't say just in framing the question, but also in the whole process for managing and collecting the science and managing the resource. So for example, if the data don't exist, the data aren't being collected to help us clearly establish whether there's a link between land uses and sockeye production, then that gap, because say they weren't included in the process of asking the right questions or the questions that are of most interest, then that's a gap, and so it leads to those challenges in the science that we're unable to definitively test for some of these cause-effect relationships.
Thanks.
So that's one example.
That leads well into my next question, which is, and I'm assuming you'd agree with me that really the data that's available then is largely responsive to what collection has been the emphasis of concern historically, and then what data is being funded, what the collection of data being funded today. Do you agree with that?
I would agree with that, though I would also add that in terms of reaching our conclusions, I think there are some weaknesses in the data, though the evidence that we evaluated in coming to our conclusion is still that it's unlikely that freshwater influences are a contributor.
And I'm also curious to hear some of your thoughts on uncertainty. And would you agree that the existence of uncertainties does not necessarily preclude action or decision by management agencies?
I'd agree with that.
Would you agree that rather it's the uncertainties that inform the risk tolerance considerations? And that it's the uncertainties that must be explained by the scientists or others to the decision makers, including the implications of not taking action in light of uncertainties?
I'd agree that uncertainties inform people's risk tolerances in terms of what is a key uncertainty to one person. They might not be willing to take certain actions given that uncertainty, whereas someone else may be. So it does inform risk tolerance. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to move more specifically now to the report, Exhibit 562. And Mr. Lunn, if you could please pull up page 130. Ms. Wachowski, one of the things that you were tasked with doing, and which is outlined in the statement of work, was to critically evaluate these alternate methodologies for determining CU status. Perhaps we don't need to look at it specifically, but it is there in 3.2. And so we've heard how you looked at the Faber-Langedon methodology and the Pestle and Cass and the Holt et al. And actually, sorry, Mr. Lunn, if you could go to page 95, I think that'll be more helpful. So I'd like to take you to Table 2 and speak with you in a little more detail about some of the differences in the methodologies, those three methodologies. If you could scroll down, yeah, so the data needs and availability section is what I'm going to be looking at. Would you agree that in terms of the data considered, the Pestle and Cass methodology is the only methodology that explicitly mentions the use of traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK?
I would agree with that.
And would you agree with me that the wild salmon policy explicitly notes as a principle, and it's principle number 3, that resource management decisions will reflect the best science, including Aboriginal traditional knowledge? I can take you to the part of the wild salmon policy if you want to verify that. It's page 9 of Exhibit 8. But really what I'm wanting to get to is a question to you. And that's, given that one of your tasks was to critically evaluate these different methodologies for determining CU status, can you offer your perspective on the failure of the other methodologies, and that's the Holt et al. And the Faber-Langedon ones, to include this consideration of traditional ecological knowledge?
I think it's premature of me to, at this point, say whether or not it's a failure of the Holt method, in the sense that it's not actually the Holt method nor the Grant method are actually, they have not actually been put forward as the ultimate methods by which DFO will be using to assess status. So I can't comment on that at this time.
Okay, so speaking hypothetically, if either the Holt et al. Method or the Grant method was ultimately put forward as the final method for determining CU status, would you then view it as a failure if they didn't explicitly include consideration of TEK in the data collection stage?
if the Holt method and the grant method in and of themselves with no other inputs were the way that status was assessed, it would not be in accordance with Principle 3 of the Wild Salmon Policy.
Thank you. And do you have any suggestions for this commission on how any methodologies chosen for determining and assessing CU status, and this is for both of you, could incorporate TEK in its data?
Sorry, can you repeat the first part of that question?
Do you have any suggestions on how whatever methodology is ultimately chosen for assessing CU status could best incorporate TEK?
Off the top of my head, I can't really speak to this because I think it's an incredibly difficult thing to do because you're combining different perspectives and different worldviews, and it's not something to be taken lightly and to just throw out a couple of suggestions. I think there's a lot of good work out there that sort of speaks to what you're trying to get an answer to.
Thank you, I heard that. I'll move now to complexity and feasibility of the various methods that you looked at. And I think that's at the previous page, at page 94 of that same table. So what I took away from what you said on Thursday, Ms. Wachowski, and from the section of Table 2 is that the hold it all approach is by far the most data-intensive and statistically intensive method of the 3 methods that you evaluated. Is that correct?
Yes.
And at this point in time, before the grant et al. Paper is finalized and peer-reviewed, this would appear that the Holt et al. Method is the direction the DFO may be heading. Is that correct?
Not being aware of any other methods out on the table, I would say yes.
And I want to put an observation to you and have you comment on it. It's our client's observation that with potentially contentious issues, such as moving from monitoring salmon and run timing groups to monitoring them and thinking about them in terms of CUs, DFO has a tendency to gravitate to the approach that is scientifically precise and quantitative as possible. Is that a fair observation? Do you agree with that?
I don't feel I can actually comment on
that. Perhaps you could comment on this one then. Is it your opinion that DFO is heading down the precautionary path and heading to a fulsome implementation of the WSP in a manner that reflects the words of that policy with the methodology that's proposed in the Holt et al. Paper?
Not being knowledgeable of other aspects of Strategy 1, I don't feel I can give a fair assessment of whether or not they are. I would say that definitely within Holt's method, it speaks to multiple parts of Strategy 1 within the wild salmon policy.
Okay, so maybe I'll go just a little broader then. Would your analysis in report number 3, support the conclusion that less quantitative methods for assessing CUs yield results that could be just as helpful to resource managers as the more quantitative and data-intensive methods?
I think if done, qualitative methods or less quantitative methods, if done in a way that is robust and defensible and transparent, I think those are and have the potential to be useful to answering management questions in the absence of more rigorous quantitative analyses.
Thank you.
I would add to that, though, we do say in our report that we certainly believe there's value in doing a more structured comparison of the results from different methods and seeing how consistent they are. And so if you have something that's very rigorous compared to something that's less rigorous, but they're giving you similar results, then maybe just in terms of feasibility and implementability, you might want to go, given the constraints you have, you might want to go with a less rigorous method. So, but certainly we recommend and mention that in the report about having that structured comparison being done.
Thank you.
And I think even within Holt's method, there are various points in which she specifically speaks to this point about in the absence of being able to define quantitative benchmarks or using more scientifically robust methods, more qualitative methods are a good substitute in the interim.
Thanks. I'd like to move to a discussion with you about a statement at the bottom of page 9, and it's in regards to the distribution metric. And I think it was in a conversation that you were having with Mr. Timberg on Thursday that you said that one of the shortcomings, so not necessarily oversights, but shortcomings of the grant it all method for assessing the status of CUs was its failure to include distribution as a class of indicators. Did I understand that correct?
Correct.
And so I wonder if you could explain for me and for this commission just what distribution as a class of indicators really looks at.
Well, referring back to the metrics that Holt et al. Put forward, it looked at the distribution of sockeye across different types of spawning habitat. It spoke to, I think there are 4 classes of, or 4 metrics that they were using. One option was to look at the distribution of the population from a numbers perspective, so whether the population was more concentrated, or if there was 4 spawning habitats, but 90% of the population used one of those spawning habitats. So looking at that spatial distribution. There's also metrics that could be used looking at the historical distribution of spawning, for example, or rearing, and how that relates or how that compares to current distributions.
And I think I heard you also today talk about how distribution metrics can be used as surrogate measures for diversity. Is that right?
Yeah. It sort of tries to speak to genetic diversity or life history diversity.
And would you agree that distribution metrics are also important for making observations about phenological changes? So changes like distribution and temporal trends, changes that are happening that way?
Could you define?
Well, my understanding of phenological changes is that the salmon are reacting, like changing the time in which they migrate, that sort of thing. And would the distribution metric help in explaining that as well? Or look at that at all?
I'd say we talk about this at the beginning of the report. So insofar as some of a recent study from Bristol Bay and looking at the diversity of sockeye there, they certainly found that the freshwater and kind of watershed variation and variability contributed to the overall diversity and resilience of the aggregate complex. So I would agree insofar as looking at that evidence.
Okay. And would you agree that distribution metrics are also relevant to the type of assessments that COSEWIC does?
Yes.
And would you agree that distribution metrics also provide a link to First Nations rights, in that many First Nations communities, they're dispersed throughout the watershed, and particular communities rely on particular CUs, so, the carrier people in the Upper Fraser may rely more on the Takla Trembleur and the Nadina that spawn in their territories, so looking at distribution can also then have a link to the exercise of First Nations rights.
Yes.
Thank you. Would you also agree that the gathering of local ecological knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge regarding the distribution of CUs, both historically and in present day, is a task that's doable and consistent with the wild salmon policy and international standards?
Can you maybe condense your question down into something more?
I'll try to break it down a bit. I guess I'm seeking your agreement on whether local ecological knowledge and TEK, the gathering of this is something that's required under the WSP and is required under international standards, and it would help move forward our database of knowledge about distribution metrics.
I'm hesitant to use the word required because I don't know whether there's implications associated with that word, but definitely.
Would it be helpful?
It sort of falls into the principle 3 that we've been referencing within the wild salmon policy.
Thanks. I'm noting the time, and it is 12:30. I'm about halfway through my questions, so if we could break now and continue. Thank you.
Hearing is now adjourned until 2 o'clock.